Hello and welcome to Brits Explained, where I attempt to explain the weird and wonderful world of Blighty to non-British people around the world. In this episode I will be talking about British humour. Why am I talking about British humour? Well, British humour is very much deeply tied into British society, our sensibilities, our values, and effectively our language. To fully understand the British English language, one must also understand how we use our humour. So without any further ado, let us begin. What is British humour? Well, to put it simply, British humour is a combination of irony, sarcasm, deadpan, wit, banter, self-deprecation and innuendo. So irony is where you highlight a situation where the opposite of what is intended has happened. Say you are at a vegetarian food eating competition and the winner appears to be a man who is a staunch meat eater, and then you can say to yourself, "And isn't it ironic?" Next up is sarcasm, and this is the use of irony, such as the one I gave in my example, for ridicule or a comedic effect. This can also take place as saying the opposite of what you mean. So for example, if something is really bad, you can say, "Oh, that was so great." And this usually depends on the tone, how you emphasize each word. So you can say, "Oh, it's really good," when really you mean it was really bad. Often this tends to confuse a lot of people who are non-Brits. So the use of sarcasm is a very, very subtle aspect of British humour. Next up is deadpan, and this is usually done with a serious tone and a straight face. The more serious it is, the more funny it is. That is because in British humour we really want our jokes to be as subtle and unclear as possible, because the more subtle it is, the more harder it is to understand, and if it is hard to understand and we find it funny, that must mean the audience is clever, and British people love to feel clever. And in the same vein, wit, where you make quick and clever remarks, is also an essential part of British humour. Next up is banter, and this is a very important part of British culture, where we often make fun of our friends, our families, people who are very close to us, and this often takes place as quite harsh but playful teasing. On an international stage, this is done towards French, Germans, Americans, our neighbours, different class systems in British society. And while we can make fun of other people, we can also make fun of ourselves. So self-deprecation is another important component of British humour, where we simply make fun of ourselves and ridicule our own situations. And finally, innuendo. Innuendos help us to discuss and poke fun of topics where otherwise we would not talk about. And this is quite true for the particular time that you live in. So for example, in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, the topic of sex was very little discussed. Sex was seen as something to be ashamed of and quite dirty, which is not true, but those were the times. So the only way to discuss such topics was through innuendo. So people used to make quite subtle sex jokes or sexual innuendos in the humour in order to kind of openly talk about and discuss these topics in a very healthy and humorous way. So innuendo is a way to talk about quite taboo subjects. Now, all of this is very much opposed to American humour. American humour relies on slapstick, anecdotes, and it's far more obvious. And in effect, this leaves Americans feeling that British humour is far too sophisticated to understand, and British people think that American humour is too simple to understand. Of course, neither are true, it's just cultural differences. However, there is a grain of truth to each one. In a sense, you can sum up British humour as the absurdity of everyday life. It's just an attempt to ridicule the way that we live our lives. But to fully understand the British way of life, one must understand British society. Now, the British class system has been an integral part of British society for hundreds of years, and it is often the subject of a lot of jokes. So we have at the bottom the working class, at the middle we have the middle class, and at the top we have the upper class. The working class make fun of the middle class make fun of the working class, and everybody makes fun of the upper class. A good example of the British class system can be found in The Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling. However, I believe this is not really an interesting book, so it's up to you if you want to read it. Next up in the road to understanding British society is understanding our history. When we joke about our class, this tends to be rooted in over 2,000 years of history in the British Isles. When we joke about France, this tends to be rooted in the 100-Year War, the Napoleonic Wars, and in the Second World War, where they famously surrendered to the Germans. Jokes about Germany's mostly relates to their role in the Second World War and their supposed lack of humour when we make fun of them for this. Jokes about America tend to be quite general, but I think they mostly stem from the War of Independence and their lack of sophistication. This tends to tie back into the class aspect because a lot of working class people migrated to America, leaving the more upper class people living in the UK. So the British for hundreds of years always viewed the Americans as quite unsophisticated and rustic, and to an extent they still do. And finally, jokes about the old rivalry between England and Scotland goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. So we can laugh at other people, but most importantly, we laugh at ourselves the most. Culturally speaking, America tends to be quite an optimistic nation. In contrast, Brits are very cynical and realistic about their situation. Effectively, the Americans see themselves as the heroes, while the Brits see themselves as the underdogs. And this is well illustrated in our choice of comedic characters, such as Rowan Atkinson's Mr. Bean, John Cleese's Basil Fawlty, and Delboy Trotter, who can be described as a dodgy trader at best. In stark contrast, the American comedic characters are already on top. They're well polished, they get the girls, they have all the funny lines. However, I don't really find them funny. Mostly because it's funnier to laugh at ourselves. A good example of British self-deprecation can be found in this pamphlet, titled What to Say Before You Eat. In France they say Bon Appetit. In Germany they say Guten Appetit. In Italy they say Buon Appetito. In Britain they say never mind. So, British humour in the English language. This is important. In the UK, everybody, and I mean everybody, is a bloody comedian. Everybody wants to be funny, they want to show you how clever they are, and often, if you do not understand this, you will be the butt of the joke. So it's very important to understand the elements of British humour when trying to communicate with a British person, or trying to use the British English language yourself. So, to give you an example of sarcasm in everyday language, if a show didn't go so well, the performer might say, "Well, that was a bloody great performance," in a very sarcastic tone. However, sarcasm often gets lost in translation to non-Brits, and when they say, "Oh, I'm just joking," that's when the humour is lost. In British humour, we never explain the joke, and we never reveal we are joking. An example of self-deprecation in everyday conversation: "I'm so bad at cooking, I could burn water." And finally, an example of innuendo and banter is a famous expression when it's absolutely freezing cold. Someone might say, "It is colder than a witch's tit," or "It is cold enough to freeze the balls of a brass monkey." These are languages that would never make it to everyday conversation, unless it's for a humorous purpose. So it's quite lewd, it's quite controversial, and most of all, it's funny. In addition to all of this, we love to hate puns. Now, puns are a play on words, and it's often used for comedic effect. However, if you use puns a lot, people may react negatively to it. This is just a standard reaction you will get. So, for example, Planet of the Grapes, Titanic, British Airways. So as you can see, we have a love-hate relationship with puns. We love to make puns, but we hate to hear puns. So finally, to sum up everything, British people love to feel clever. This is the most important thing that you should know. We enjoy Sudoku, we enjoy crosswords, pub quizzes, university challenge, TV quiz shows, etc. And therefore, a very sharp and subtle joke should never be explained. Therefore, an audience who laughs is then made to feel smart just for understanding the joke. This element is crucial in British humour. However, there is a fine art to British comedy, so you have to make it not too subtle, because if it's too subtle, nobody will understand the joke and it will be very embarrassing. But if it's not subtle enough, then people will feel like it's very stupid and very obvious. So there has to be quite a balance to it. And the ultimate point, everything that I've told you is replicated in everyday conversation. We use all of these in British English. As I mentioned, everybody is a comedian. And finally, I will leave you with a joke which may or may not come from Oscar Wilde. And it goes, "Humour is superior than humour." My name is Ash, and this has been Brits Explained. I will see you in the next episode.